We rolling?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Let's go.
You had the thumb up.
I didn't know what you were doing.
You had the thumb
I
up.
had a thumb up. I had a
But
thumb
we've
up.
already done the thumb more thing.
We've done the thumb more thing.
But to those who watch us on a consistent basis, that may seem like years ago because we have been away, but now we're back.
Years
Welcome.
or 5 weeks.
Welcome to the Tuck and Tom
Has it
Show.
been 5 weeks or 6 weeks? 5 or 6 weeks.
You don't know.
Yeah, welcome to Tuck and Tom Show.
Welcome to the
But we're going to we got 5 weeks going strong, Lord willing. And then we're going to be back to 5 weeks off probably.
I haven't made up my mind on that.
Well, I'll be out of town at least for part
You'll
of
be
it.
here. You'll be here.
I'll be out
and
of town for at least part
and we'll
of it.
pipe you in if we need to. But yeah, comment in the comment section below if we should give Tom an off week. I'm debating.
Yeah, comment because we'll read it.
We will.
Will we?
Yeah.
How many comments have you read off of
All
ours?
of them.
No,
all
you
of
haven't.
them.
No,
yes.
you have not.
Yes, I read
No, you
all.
have
But
not.
me, you know what? Me and Matt read one from the last post. It was really good.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Matt failed the test.
What test?
The comment said, "This video makes me think of da 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 comma da da da." Yeah.
I don't understand.
Yeah, it was in reference to the last podcast we did talking about Indiana Jones.
Okay.
And so I was like, read it again. And it was da 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 da.
Oh, da da da.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
So I read the
Okay.
comments.
Yeah, so I've only read one or two comments that were on the same video, and I don't know why I clicked on it. I clicked on it, I was like, oh, they're comments? And then I read them, and they weren't great. I don't remember what they were now.
Well, for those of you commenting, thank you. I think they are great. But you and I disagree all the time. That's fine.
It's
That can
fine.
happen.
I know it's
Doesn't matter. We don't have
fine.
to agree on everything.
But you didn't read the comments of it that I'm
appreciate
talking
comments.
about. Yeah.
I appreciate
I appreciate comments too. I just don't know if we're going to read them.
So, okay. Matt, clean this all up. Let's get down to it.
Nope, Matt. Include it.
So,
now the question is Matt on that side or is it on this side?
yeah, exactly. So we're back from Israel.
We are back
Today
from Israel.
we are also back into...
We're not back today. We've been back a while, but we
No,
are
but
back
we
now.
are also back into the rhythm of you teaching through the book of Revelation. So
Yes.
we have some questions from the audience, and then maybe we'll do a little Israel recap, just some things that stood out to you
Yeah,
from our
sounds
time
good.
away.
We
And
need to make sure to...
if you haven't signed up for our next Israel trip, what do you think?
I think you should sign up, although you and I are probably not going next time, right?
I am. And
You
I
are.
hope you can come
I could have
too.
swore you were going with me to India.
Yeah, well, we're going to that too.
I
Sign
can't
up,
do both.
Sign up for
We're gonna be
India.
at the same time.
Sign up for India as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, are
Questions,
you ready?
yes.
Are you
So
ready?
questions about the book of Revelation from the teaching from last night, right?
Some questions, as always, from the book of Revelation and
And other questions.
and
that aren't.
other questions of life that people think that you would be a good source of
Yeah, for sure.
of wisdom upon. So, in fact,
Yeah.
the very first question that we have today comes from Anonymous, and it's from Mark chapter 11, verse 25. Would
Yep.
you like to read it?
Yeah, which is, by the way, interesting because you're going to be teaching on this
Correct.
chapter here really soon.
So perhaps someone in last night's audience is
Kind of anticipating.
reading ahead, looking
Yeah.
at a forecast of where we'll be this Sunday, which
Yeah.
will be in Mark chapter 11, where we'll be talking about Jesus cleansing the temple,
Yeah.
cursing a fig tree, talking about prayer and forgiveness. So what does it say?
Yeah. Mark 11:25 says, "You are not forgiven if you do not forgive." How do you respond to someone saying they can't be saved because of this? Who should go first on this? Since I asked the question, is it your response first?
I think that these kind of verses are simple to read at face value. And what it's saying is if you don't forgive people, you aren't forgiven. And anyone who has a struggle with that, this verse is a problem for them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think most people who have experienced the power of salvation, that is the forgiveness of sins, understand that this verse is not threatening. This verse is an overflow, from your salvation flows an understanding of deep and meaningful personal forgiveness that then is extended to people in your life. The only reason that this verse could ever be a problem is if you do not want to forgive. And if you don't want to forgive, that is a problem.
Yeah.
So the verse says what it means, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the things we have to be careful of as we kind of reflect on verses like this, because this is one of many different kinds of verses, right? I mean,
Yes.
in 1 John chapter 3, you got John saying, "My brethren, do not be deceived. He who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. And he who practices sin is of the devil." So he goes in and he says, whoever knows Jesus, he says, whoever knows him does not sin, right? That's a pretty extreme verse. And it's really hard to wrap your head around it because, of course, we all sin. So the Bible is full of stuff where it says things like, if you're not doing something, that is indication that you do not know God. Mm-hmm. That's fundamentally what we're saying. Now, don't get me wrong, and I hope our viewers don't misunderstand me. I'm not, in quoting that, trying to say if you ever sin, you're not a Christian. We all sin. Everybody sins. The point of that passage, and I think the point of this passage and so many like it, is that fundamentally Christ came to save sinners. And that doesn't just mean get them to heaven.
Correct.
That doesn't just mean we're getting you into the presence of God. That's part of it, of course. But it's also that he's transforming us, right? In the book of Galatians, Paul says, if there was a commandment that could have been given that would have made people righteous, God would have given it. Like, if he could have written a commandment that said, forgive people or be righteous, and if it worked by just giving the commandment, he would have done that. But it didn't work. The book of Galatians is an argument how the law is not effective at making people righteous.
And it's not designed to be.
And it's not designed to be. He actually goes on to say that the law is there specifically for condemnation. That is that when you compare your works against the law and you see you fail, then you know, that's when you know you need a savior. You know you need salvation. But the idea is the implication by what he says is the law doesn't make people righteous, but the Lord does. And it is the Lord's death and his resurrection that actually transforms our lives. And so the point is that when we know the Lord in fact changes us from glory to glory. Now, please, one thing I do want to say, you can't read this verse or read the verse in 1 John or anything like that and read it to mean if you ever have or ever do in an instant harbor unforgiveness, or if you ever do in an instant sin or something like that. You can't think of that as what this verse is saying. What this verse is saying is when a person is saved, what kind of a person does he become? He becomes a worker of righteousness. He becomes a person who avoids sin. He becomes a person who is forgiving. That doesn't mean that you will never sin or that you will never work unrighteousness or that you will never, like in a moment or an instant, lack forgiveness. But, of course, as a believer, what you do is you repent of those things, and then you follow the right path. So if somebody's sitting here, then to kind of your point, if somebody's saying, I don't think I'm a Christian because I'm not forgiving somebody, the answer is forgive them. That's the thing you're supposed to do. Like we are supposed to, as Christians, walk in forgiveness.
Correct. And I think the order of forgiveness is important, that he who is forgiven much will forgive.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're supposed to be these we're radical forgivers of people so that God someday will forgive us. It's like when you hear the gospel that you are saved by grace, that you can be forgiven of anything you've done. Your sin has separated you as far as from you east to west. The response of that is to be a forgiving person.
Yep.
And I think what Jesus is saying is forgive people.
Yep.
Do it. And know that if you're not forgiving people, you have a debt hanging over your head also that is requiring forgiveness.
Yep.
Yep.
So Jesus tells that wonderful parable, which is the first one that comes to mind when you think about forgiveness, where you have this great landowner who's incredibly wealthy, and he has a servant, and the servant owes him 10,000 talents. Now, that is an unpayable sum, right? A talent was a massive unit of exchange. It was 75 pounds of silver. To owe 10,000 talents, that is a sum that cannot be paid, especially as from a servant who doesn't make money, right? So the point of the parable is a guy who can't repay his debt, which is the state you and I are in. We are in a state where we cannot repay our debts. And so what happens is the ruler, this king, goes to his servant and he says, pay up. And the guy says, I can't. So the king says, okay, take him and throw him into debtor's prison until he's paid it all. And the guy says, please give me a chance, give me time, and I will pay it all, which is kind of, I think, how most people tend to think of God. We tend to think that we need to kind of work hard to make up for what we have done. And if we just get enough time, we'll be able to do it, right? This is actually kind of what I think is behind the doctrine of purgatory that some people believe, that Catholics and some Protestants believe, this idea that when you die, you go into purgatory, because in people's minds, there's this idea, by the way, this idea is wrong, just so you know, but there's this idea that people have that, well, at the end of this life, I'm not going to be what I should be. I will not have made up for all the wrongs I've done. So in the next life, I need to continue, because that's the only way I'll have enough time to kind of make it. That's a psychological thing that we all have. And that's what this guy's saying is just give me enough time, I'll be able to pay it. And I can't tell you how many debtors I have met who are like, oh, I just need time, I'll get caught up. They always think they'll get caught up, even when you look at it and say, there's no way they can get caught up. And so what happens is the king says to him, I forgive it. I just forgive it all. I'm just going to forgive it. Because the only way that you could actually be right with respect to his debt. Now, in this parable, of course, the king represents God, and the servant represents you or me, right? It's us, the person who owes the debt to God. God forgives it. Now then, as the parable goes on, the man then goes out, and there's a guy who owes him 100 denarii, which is a large sum. People don't realize it's quite a large sum. A denarius would have been close to, depending on how much money you made, like for an average worker, one denarius would be just over a day's worth of work. So it's a lot of work, right? I mean, that's 100 days straight of work, just saving up all that money and paying, or more than 100 days. You're paying 150 days worth of your work. I mean, that's almost half your income for a year, right? That's a significant amount of money. But it is payable. Like that's a debt that's payable. And the guy goes to him and says, this servant who's just been forgiven goes and says, please pay me. And the guy says, I will, just give me time. And he says, nope, I'm actually handing you over to debtor's prison until you pay me the last penny. Yeah. And then when the king hears that, by the way, because all of his fellow servants are like, well, that's horrible. Yeah. They go to the king, and the king's like, okay, you wicked servant. And he hands him over to the torturers to be tortured, right?
Yeah. Which is essentially the parable that explains exactly this principle.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been forgiven.
You've been forgiven.
Why is this a verse that's a problem if you've been forgiven?
Exactly. And the thing I want people to understand is, and you've already said this, so I just want to say it another way, which is that we don't receive God's forgiveness because we're forgiving. We receive God's forgiveness, and because we receive God's forgiveness, we become forgivers.
Yes.
That's the flow here. We don't earn his salvation. We don't earn his forgiveness. We become forgivers. And if we're not forgiving, then what that seems to imply in this is that we don't understand God's forgiveness. We haven't received it in the way that we're supposed to. We don't get it the way that we're supposed to.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
And forgiveness, just as we think about this, is an example of every virtuous thing that we ever do flowing from God first.
Yeah.
So this is how love works. We receive God's love. We're like, well, you love us, and then we're about love. This is how patience works.
Yep.
This is how all of the 1 Corinthians attributes of God's love, kindness, because God has been kind to us, we are supposed to be kind people.
Yep.
And that is how we now take on the responsibility of image bearer.
Yeah.
We bear the image of a forgiving God.
Yeah.
We bear the image of a patient, long-suffering, kind, loving God.
Yeah.
And so forgiveness is just part of the flow of God's character.
And it doesn't mean you do it perfectly.
No.
You'll stumble, you'll fail. But the point is you get up and you repent and you walk forward. The person who sits there and says, I'm not going to forgive, is not doing that.
Yes.
The person who stumbles in his forgiveness, who harbors a little bit of bitterness, comes to the realization, he repents, he forgives. And then when he stumbles again, he picks himself up and he does it again. But when a person is just like, don't care, not going to do it, that's indicative that he doesn't know the Lord.
Yeah.
And so, that's the big thing. I want to address one more thing here. There's an evangelical theology that I would say kind of popped up. I mean, it seems to me really kind of late 19th century, early 20th century, but it was very impactful in terms of how American Christians kind of think, where there's this tendency to think that being a Christian boils down to a preacher preached a message, you raised your hand, you went forward at the altar call, you signed on the dotted line, you said you're a Christian, and now it doesn't matter how you live your life because God's going to just forgive everything. That's partly rooted in a truth, but it's an incomplete truth and it's a falsehood. That is false, and that's the way Satan deals, right? He deals in incomplete truths. He's always telling you a little bit of the truth. The truth is God does forgive all of our trespasses, like he does. Not just past trespasses as Christians, but past, present, and future. And because of that, we can walk in confidence. When I stumble and fall, I know God is there with me. I know he's going to wash that. And not just going to, he did wash it in the blood of Christ. But if I'm just to sit there and to cling to my sin, if I cling to it and say, I don't care, I'm going to keep doing it because God doesn't really care what I do, well, I've missed the point. Because the point isn't to cleanse me so that I can keep sinning. The point is to cleanse me so that I can be righteous. And so that's what John was talking about in 1 John 3 when he says, "My beloved, do not be deceived. He who practices righteousness is righteous, as he is righteous, as Jesus is righteous, and he who sins is of the devil." It's not that if you've ever sinned. In fact, 1 John chapter 1 says that if you do not, or if anybody says he has no sin, he is a liar and the truth is not in him. So same author, 1 John chapter 1 says, if you say you have no sin, you're a liar and the truth is not in you. But he then says in chapter 3, if you sin, that's indicative that you're of the devil, not of the Lord, right? So this is an important tension that we have to walk in. We are going to sin, but we do not walk and live in sin and just embrace it and just say, well, we're forgiven, so that's all. No, we repent every time and we get back up and we're confident that God washes us, and then we move forward. Another one is Proverbs, oh goodness, I'm forgetting the exact reference. Proverbs 24:16 maybe? 16, I think it's 24:16. The righteous man falls 7 times, but he gets back up. The righteous man falls 7 times, but he gets back up. The wicked man falls and is consumed in his destruction. And it's the same thing with forgiveness. You're going to stumble. Get back up.
And I think one of the ways this tension is either a horrible burden or something that is just corrective is how you read the word. Do you read this word as a reminder to a truth that is, when I read this and I'm like, oh, be a forgiving person because I've been forgiven? Or do you read this as a problem passage that needs to be explained on why you don't? The word says simple things that I think remind us that we constantly need to practice the right flow from God's character into our lives. And so this verse, for all of you who believe and read it, let it be a reminder.
Yeah.
Don't let it be a burden. Just let it be a reminder to how we're supposed to live.
Yeah.
So, okay, question number 2. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you for that, by the way.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
I was really, I want to say I really appreciate you as a friend, and I never want anything to come between us, so let's always forgive each other.
Oh yeah. Very good. Very good. Very good. Same. I feel the same.
Yes. Please discuss being a single Christian. Include Christians who don't want to be single, Christians single by choice, Christians called by God to be single. So when I first read this, I thought, oh, well, this is, for the viewing audience that doesn't know, you are, in fact, a single Christian.
I am.
But you also will have to speak with commentary on some of these things because you don't fit every category that they've asked to be addressed.
Yeah.
Unless, because it says these are actually conflicting categories, single by choice and don't want to be single.
Yeah.
So you have to decide which one you want to speak to with personal experience. And then I would say all Christians who are single at the moment of their singleness, following Jesus and trusting God, are called to be single for that time. Whether you're wanting and hoping or whether you're determined to be single and you feel like that's something that you're committing to long term. Yeah. But can you please, as was requested, discuss being a single Christian?
Yeah. Now, I do have to say, kind of to start, this is a very big category. I kind of don't know exactly how to move in terms of direction. I would encourage whoever wrote that question to maybe write something if you get a chance, or if I don't address what you're kind of curious about, if you could maybe write a more specific question.
In the comments?
Or maybe, I would say send it in next time. Maybe in the comments. I do want to try to actually read the comments. I just keep forgetting. I forgot they were even there. That was my point.
Very common YouTube videos to have comments. That's been a long-running YouTube policy to allow comments under the videos. I just don't
look at it.
Long-running policy of YouTube.
I would prefer that you send in another question next week when we do the next
maybe
slide.
Letters. Maybe they write a letter.
Do an email, I guess. Email. But all this to say, because I could talk about 1,000 different things. So I'll just try to give a couple of thoughts that came to my mind when I read this, and they're all scriptural for the most part. It's not really experiential. So if you're looking, so the question, or the it's more of like just a request, right? Discuss being a single Christian.
Yeah, like what does that mean? Does that discuss how you use your time? Does that discuss how you are? You're like, is that discuss your heart's desires?
Yeah, or is it a question about like, what is the nature of singleness in the Christian life?
Or like a comment of like, where do singles fit into the modern day church? Because sometimes people feel like it's like marriage and college, and then there's this like in between, like singles kind of lose their footing maybe. Yeah. So I have maybe felt that.
No,
okay. I don't about that. I mean, you're my great friend. So.
No, I mean, so I have a lot of, but I'm sure some people do, right? I mean, I don't want to be dismissive. I'm sure a lot of people do feel that way.
Yeah.
But I I had a couple of passages of scripture that came to mind.
Do it.
So I'll just go ahead and read them.
Awesome.
So the first one is Matthew 19 in verse 11. I kind of love the setup for this. You taught on divorce a little bit ago.
I did.
And you did quote the parallel passage from Matthew 19 on divorce, where Jesus basically says if you divorce your wife and remarry, you're committing adultery if you do it for an unjust cause, right? We talked about all that stuff. But what I love about this is after he teaches this, the disciples go, well, then if that's the case, it's better to not even get married. Like,
they're like, what? That seems pretty extreme.
That's extreme. Like, I mean, it's hard to say exactly what they were thinking because you only have the words. But what it reads to me like is they kind of earlier in their lives just approached it as like, yeah, we're getting married, but we're totally open to getting divorced if this doesn't turn out very well. And it would be really foolish to get married if that was actually just meant to always be there, the case. So it's interesting. They say, well, then why even get married? And Jesus' response isn't to point out the wrong-headed thinking on there, which I think their thinking was wrong-headed, but I think that's because he's making a different point. But he says in verse 11, all cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. There are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. So, a eunuch, of course, is somebody who, technically a real eunuch is somebody who is castrated, okay? So being castrated, he cannot sire children, right?
Sire children.
I'm sorry, use the more...
I love it.
That's the right word, though. He cannot beget children, right?
I like that.
Now, eunuchs, of course, are pretty rare in today's day and age, but once upon a time, they were common. Eunuchs commonly attended upon the kings of various Asian, Eastern nations, and that's because the eunuchs worked in the palace. And who else lived in the palace? Well, the king's queen and the concubines and his whole harem, as well as his daughters. And you don't want your advisors sleeping with the daughters and the wives of the king. So consequently, a lot of advisors would be eunuchs. That's the first category he's talking about. That there are eunuchs. Oh, no, sorry. That's the second category. Dang it. I went to the second category. That is eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men. So eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men are taken and castrated by men to serve in these luxurious places. The first category of eunuchs that he mentions in verse 12 are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb. So this is a reality that some people just have been born eunuchs. So Jesus says those are two categories, and he's using it all to get to his third category, which will be relevant now. And he prefaces everything by saying, all cannot accept this saying, meaning not everybody can kind of bear this. But the third thing is there are those who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. And I don't think he means literally. He's not saying that they are literally making themselves eunuchs, castrating themselves the way that these second category had been. He's saying that there's this third category of people who are going to be in the kingdom who are just never going to get married. They're never going to have kids. That's not the thing they're going to do. And once you know, he says not everybody would be able to accept that calling. And then the last bit, he says, he who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Okay? He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Now I'm going to take you to one more passage of Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul makes a pretty extensive, or I should say offers a pretty extensive discourse on both the nature of marriage and on when divorce is allowed, when it is not allowed, things like that, but also for the life of a single person. Verse 20. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Don't be concerned about it. If you were made free, use it. He was called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who was called while free is the Lord's slave. So what he's saying here is he's saying, when you are called to become a Christian, don't be concerned about the state of life you're in. When he says basically, were you called as a Gentile? Don't seek to become a Jew because you think being a Jewish Christian is better than being a Gentile Christian. Mm-hmm. He's saying, were you called as a Jewish Christian? Great, be a Jewish Christian. Were you called as a Gentile Christian? Great, be a Gentile Christian. Were you called while you were a slave? He's not endorsing slavery here. What he's saying, don't fret about it. He says, be the Christian slave that you can be. Mm-hmm. And if you can be free, then take it. But don't let it be a thing that consumes your life. Mm-hmm. That's what he's saying. And he talks about this in regards to singleness as well. Because he says, now concerning virgins, meaning, of course, young women who have not been married. I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy is trustworthy. Now, what he means by that is, he says no commandment has come down from Jesus that specifically says what should happen to single people. He's like, I don't have commandments from Jesus on that. But he says, but I know the Lord, and I think that I have wisdom. Please don't misunderstand this passage to think that he means that what he's about to say is not Scripture and is not inspired by God. He's not thinking in those terms. He's saying, I think I'm trustworthy. I don't have a commandment specifically from Jesus, so I'm going to give you advice. And it just so happens, unbeknownst to him, this is going to end up in Scripture. Okay? So, he says, I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. Skipping down to verse 27, are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be loosed. Like, are you married? Don't try to get divorced. Don't try to change that. Don't, in your marriage, sit there and go, oh, I hate being married. Let me try to become unmarried. He says, are you loosed from a wife? Meaning, are you single? Do not seek a wife. Now, again, he's not saying you can't get married. He's just saying don't, follow Jesus. That's what he's saying. Follow Jesus, and whatever state you're in, be content in that state.
There's no perfect Christian category of styles of...
And then he says, even if you do get married, you have not sinned, right? He says that right in the next verse, 28. But even if you do get married, you have not sinned. Like, it's like, I'm not telling you not to get married, because you're doing something wrong. What he's saying is, don't fret about your state. Don't fret about the affair, the state of affairs that you're in. And I tie this back to what we read in Matthew 19, where Jesus says, not everybody can accept this. Like, it's not easy for everybody to take. But he says, but some people are called to be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, meaning some people are actually called to remain in that unmarried state. And then he says, nevertheless, if you do that, this is very interesting. He says, you will have trouble in the flesh, and I would spare you. What he means by that, he's going to explain. He says, I want to skip down to verse 32. What I want you to be is without care. In other words, I don't want you to have to be, burdened with concerns and weights that will hinder you from the gospel and from the focus that he wants. He says, he who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. He who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. Now, when he says this could be taken very wrongly. So I want to make sure that I explain this in a way that makes sense. What he's saying is, if you are a husband or a wife, right, if you're married to somebody, then you have a lot of obligation. And everybody who's married and everybody who has children knows this. These are concerns that take up a significant portion of your mental energy, your spiritual energy. You have to focus on it. And by the way, the scriptures make it very clear that it is a commandment from God that is what you're supposed to be pouring your energy into. You cannot shirk that responsibility. And he says, don't try to avoid it when you have it, ever. But what he is also saying is, he's saying, but are you not married? Then don't fret about it, because there is an advantage to being unmarried. That's what he's saying. There is an advantage. And that advantage is you are free to not have those concerns and those cares. And with that freedom, he says you should take that energy that you would have spent there and use it for the Lord. Use it to focus on the kingdom. You can do things that other people can't. And so, by the way, he's sharing this because this is his state. He is unmarried. He does not have children. By the way, as a little tangent, I've heard a lot of people argue that Paul was married. And the argument that I've heard for that is that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the local council of elders in there was the main Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and then there were councils of elders all throughout Israel. And people argue that he was married at one point because you couldn't be in the Sanhedrin if you weren't married. Now, I've actually not verified that. I have not read into what the rules are for the Sanhedrin. But here's the thing, and this is really important. We have no reason to think Paul was ever in the Sanhedrin. He was not an old man when he converted to Christ. There is no indication that he was a rabbi in the book of Acts. He was a student, in fact. We know that. He was a student of Gamaliel, who was a part of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin. And so I'm not saying he definitely wasn't part of the Sanhedrin. I'm just saying we have no reason to think he was part of the Sanhedrin. And so because of that, even if that was true, that all people in the Sanhedrin had to be married, or all men in the Sanhedrin had to be married, that Paul was therefore at one point married, we don't even know if he was in the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
So we don't, I'm not saying Paul might not have been married. Maybe he was, and maybe his wife died, and maybe he was divorced. I don't know, because it doesn't say. But what I can say is that here he was not married. And I would also add that there's no reason to think he was ever married. And so what I do think he's essentially saying is he's speaking from his own experience, that he served with apostles and leaders in the church who were married, like Peter, right? And church tradition tells us that Peter's wife was crucified, just like Peter was. So what does that mean? That means Peter, and according to tradition, Peter had to watch it happen. So Peter, therefore, has a burden that he has to wear that Paul doesn't. When Peter goes to preach the gospel, he brings his wife and he brings his children. When Peter suffers persecution, his wife and his children also suffer persecution. His heart has to be divided in a way that Paul's isn't. Paul's like, it's just me. I'm costing nobody on this. I'm just giving my life for the gospel. He's simply saying that there is an advantage to it, and that's how we should view it. And I think that's how you should view it. He says, continuing on, he says, the unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of this world, how she may please her husband. And then he says, this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, that you may serve the Lord without distraction. He's like, I'm just trying to give you kind of a little bit of advice that I think was helpful in my life. But then he goes on and says, but if you get married or if you give your daughter in marriage, that's fine. You don't do anything wrong. Do it. He says, please feel free. He's like, I'm just giving you a little bit of advice. So here we have it. We have Paul basically saying that being single in the church is, in a way, a gift, like something that a person could have, which could enable them to have a freedom to minister in ways that married people might not be able to. By the way, that doesn't mean they're going to be better, like a better person. It doesn't mean they're going to be more fruitful. Like, it's hard to get more fruitful than Peter, and Peter was married. You know what I mean? Like, he's the guy that Jesus called the rock upon whom he would build his church. Peter was married. So it's not to say that automatically you're going to be more fruitful or more useful in ministry or any of those things. It is simply to say that you have an ability to have a single-mindedness that a married man or a married woman doesn't have. What's that?
Pun intended.
Yeah, pun intended. Actually, it wasn't. It was pun unintended.
Unintended pun.
Unintended pun. So all that to say, that's kind of my general feeling on it.
Do you have a response to those who are hoping for a season of singleness to turn into marriage versus those who feel like they're just supposed to be single? Do you feel like those are categorically different, styles of singleness, or because the question asks, there's some who are hoping and there are some who are content in singleness?
I have a bunch of thoughts to that. First, let me say this. There are a lot of people who think that the gift of singleness that Paul's describing here, and that Jesus describes in Matthew 19, that being a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven, a lot of people think that what that means is that a person would not even want to get married, that they wouldn't ever even want to. That's how you know. So like people will come around and they'll say, well, I want to be married, therefore I won't be that guy. Yeah. And I don't believe that. There's nowhere in the Bible where it says that, and I don't think there's any reason to think that that's the case, right? Yeah. The people that I do know of who are Christians who remain single through the bulk of their lifetime, I think it kind of just happened. I don't think that they intended specifically.
At a young age, determined.
Yeah. And I've had people, I think, assume that about me. I've had no intention to not marry, right? It just has happened that way. And I do and always have hoped to get married. I don't have confidence that will ultimately happen.
And you don't have a lack of confidence either.
I don't really have a lack of confidence either. It's true. I just don't know what I mean. So. And
you are kind of a living testament to the passages of scriptures that you read. You have, because of your, in a sense, free agency. Yeah. You have been able to do a lot of amazing things for the kingdom that otherwise you probably wouldn't have.
I have freedoms to do things. Now I will say something though, and this is something I do regret. Because I do remember in my younger years when I was like 20, I mean, friends of mine who knew me really well in my 20s, they knew I would talk about this. And there were times when I was like, I wonder, that'd be, I thought about it. Like I never committed to it at all, but I certainly thought about it. But one thing I can look back on is I can see how as a single man, throughout my 20s and 30s and into my 40s, it's amazing how much time I have wasted, right? Time Time that, my friends and, family members or whatever who got married, they used that extra time to spend on their wives and children, and in it they were really sanctified and like they became in so many ways more adult and in so many ways better than I am, I think, because of those things. Whereas I maintained a lot of, I think, childish tendencies, just kind of like an immaturity, I think, through a lot of those things. And I think that was bad. I mean, I think that marriage and fatherhood and motherhood are sanctifying things in people's lives.
Slave to righteousness.
I mean, I think it makes people more selfless. And my living in my singleness, a big part of it has been kind of a childishness, immaturity, and selfishness. I think that is because I can be like, I can go like, oh, I can sleep in when I want to sleep in, and I can stay up late watching movies, and I can, just randomly go up and take a road trip, and I don't have any obligation that withholds me. I do think that I've had the freedom to do things for the gospel, maybe that a lot of people didn't, but I also don't feel like I've totally channeled all these energies and times and just into what I should have been.
Well, I'm sure everyone feels that.
That's probably
back
true. That's probably true.
On the pie chart of time.
Yeah. Now, I do want to get back though to because when you asked that question about like a person who is called to be single versus somebody who wants to be married, I think most people who ultimately are going to be called to be single, I think most of them do want to be married. And so I think that could be discouraging for people because I think some people want to have it reaffirmed to them that if they want it, they're definitely going to get married. I've heard people say that. That's not true. Like people can really want it and not ever get married. And that's just a reality. Yeah. And what I can say is that, now, by the way, most people do get married. So there's all sorts of reasons to think that if a person really, really wants it, that they'll be able to get married. But at the same time, I do think that, at the end of the day, the people who ultimately God has called to never marry are people most often who do want it. Now, there are probably some who don't want to be married.
I'll contribute just as a pastor over these years, just my conviction for the conversation of singleness, and I think you nailed it, is to never make a single Christian feel as though they have not really matured into the fullness of Christianity because they don't have the spouse and the multiplication.
I guess that kind of contradicts sort of what I was saying about myself a little bit. You are right.
Yeah.
But it does, because I was talking about, I only say cut you off, sorry, to make sure I qualify.
Yeah.
Because I had said how I have some immaturities and some things I think that have come, some selfishnesses that have come.
Yeah, and I don't think you're saying the solution has to be marriage. Yeah. You're just looking back and saying it's no guarantee that extra time equals extra ministry.
That's all I meant to say, yeah. And to say that there are potential detriments to your spiritual well-being for not getting married.
And I think, the main thing as a pastor who's preaching about marriage or, covering, different callings of people's lives is and I think in the same line of the Apostle Paul is to say, you do not have to be married to be an effective, useful, spirit contributing believer in a body of Christ.
And
in a local
indeed,
church.
It might be a very high calling.
And I think that is where some of our modern times maybe put pressure on people to, it's like, the pastor and his wife and his kids, and it's like there's that version of Christianity, and
this is the model.
This is the model, and it's like multiply and have lots of kids, and God, the Bible college joke, like ring by spring and bridal college, and it's like all of these. Yeah. I think some people may feel pressure as a single person to be like, what am I doing that is not, turning into the next level, and it's like this. It's not a level. Marriage is not a level of Christianity.
For sure. Yeah, and so I affirm 100% everything you just said. I want to make sure it's clear what I was talking about. Those things in my character development. I don't want to make the implication that if you're going to be single or if you are single, that necessarily is.
And of course, the same could be said.
For a married couple.
A married couple doesn't automatically mature to be more selfless.
No.
They can become more selfish.
They become way more selfish.
And you can become those stretching moments with young children actually make you a more selfish person because now you're fighting harder for your alone time and getting away from them, and you've just ruined a life. So
no, for sure. Yeah, no, very good.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah,
interesting stuff. I was single as a believer, walking with the Lord, and I remember those years and just kind of waiting and wondering, and of course you are single and now excited to see how that plays out too.
Yeah.
You never know. Comment below.
Comment below. Okay, one more question. This one's an easy one, I think.
Okay, cool. What are the main reasons why the historicist view is largely defunct? You can buy it on a discount rack.
And this is Brittany Shaw. Shout out to Brittany. So good to hear from you.
It seems like a happy medium in some ways. Is it mainly due to the focus on the papacy?
Okay, so I had somebody else actually come up and ask me after the service about this, and I realize now I'm glad you put the word defunct, Brittany. Thank you so much, because the gentleman who came up and asked me the question, I don't know if he misheard me, because I think I used the word defunct. But he came up and he said, he referenced this quote that I made, because I went through the different views, the 4 different approaches to Revelation. And when I came to the historicist view, I said, this is a view which is essentially defunct. And I don't know, I think he heard that I'd said it had been proven wrong. And so he asked me what was the proof that it was wrong. And I said, oh, no. It hasn't been proven wrong. It's not that anybody's looked at it and said, oh, this clearly can't be the view anymore. When I say defunct, I mean it's just not commonly held. There are some people. The Seventh-day Adventist Church still holds to a historicist view. So that's like one denomination that still holds to it. But it's really, really rare. And I think, although I'm not really certain why it's become so rare, it might just be a cultural thing. It might just be that American culture is so caught up with futurism and with the way that, I haven't talked about this before, and so I'm going to throw this out a little bit, but the 1980s, a man named Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth that just swept through our culture and really captured the American imagination about the Antichrist and the end of time and all of that kind of stuff. And then of course you have the Tim LaHaye, Jerry Jenkins stuff, the Left Behind series.
That's
that comes
Nicolas Cage.
That became, they had a whole bunch of different versions of the series that kind of came out with it. So I think that just so caught up our culture that people have lost interest in the old historicist view. But if there's one thing that I would say the historicist view struggles with, which might have made it less popular, is that historicists, because they're looking at all of history, for every single passage in Revelation, they can draw any comparison they want from all of history. And when you do that, you come up with 1,000 different possible meanings, and it's impossible for anybody to really wrap their head around it all. Like, it just gets exhausting. I mean, trying to read how historicists interpret each of the different passages of the book of Revelation is like exhausting, because for every historicist, you'll find 100 others who say something completely different. And so it just becomes a really difficult way to look at the book. I think that's the main reason it's not really commonly used. It might have had something. It might have had, Brittany, you say here at the end, is it mainly due to the focus on the papacy? It might have to do with that. Like the Reformation, the reformers, Martin Luther and those guys, John Calvin, those guys had a very strong animosity towards Catholicism and the papacy that still exists a little bit today, but not nearly with the kind of extreme fervor that it had back then. So maybe it's that. But at the end of the day, I think it's a combination of reasons. And I think the biggest reason is that it's just too hard to bring it all together. So
great questions. We will probably have to, I think we should just do a little Israel rendezvous soon.
Yeah, we'll have to do a separate.
We'll have to do it soon, but
rendezvous.
Still, add in the comments if you'd like to come with us. We'd love to get the momentum started. I think there's a growing list already happening on Sunday mornings. So if you go to Calvary Boise on Sunday mornings, do find Stephen Reynolds and let him know you're interested.
Yeah.
So
and we'll have an Israel recap.
Yes, we will.
Awesome.
But other than that, man, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you
so much, Tom. Yep. Forgiven?
Yes.
Oh,
likewise.
I like it.
All right, dude.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching.
Guys.
We'll see you soon.
See ya.